Today, we at the Energy Saving Trust Transport team will be continuing our webinar series with today's webinar entitled Rise of the EVs. And this webinar is focused on the rise and growth of the electric vehicle market at the moment. And specifically today, we're going to cover the drivers for shifting to electric transport, the Scottish Government strategy at the moment, we'll touch on that, and then look at the trends in the global EV market and forecasted changes that have been suggested as well. So my name is Gordon Manson, and I work at the transport team here at Energy Saving Trust. And we basically are here to help businesses and consumers make the switch to low carbon transport. We're also very luckily joined today by Dr. Ben Lane of Next Green Car and Zap-Map. And Ben's going to give us a really valuable insight into the trends in the global EV market. So some really good, juicy information from Ben. Just a couple of quick points from me before we start. First of all, we can't hear you, but you can hear us as it's a webinar. The webinar itself is due to last around 60 minutes, including questions. You can ask questions at any time during the webinar, and if you have a question, please type it into the box, the text box at the sidebar of your screen, and we will respond to those during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Due to the deluge of questions we're expecting today that might come through, it might not be possible to respond to all of the questions, so apologies in advance for this. If you're really keen to get a response to your query, our contact details will be provided at the end of the webinar, so please feel free to get in touch with us afterwards if you like. We'll also be recording the webinar, and it'll be available online in the near future, so please feel free to send a link to your colleagues, friends and family. We will also circulate the slides afterwards as well. Okay, so without further ado, we'll just get started. So this is just a slide just giving you an overview of what we're going to cover today. So after the introductions, we're going to have a quick look at government policies and targets. We'll touch on the support available from the Energy Saving Trust, and then we'll hand over to Next Green Car for the real body of today's webinar, looking at the global EV market, some trends and what the forecasts are. And then finally, we'll have a Q&A session at the end to kind of cover any points that you guys have flagged up on the way through. So first of all, just to give you a brief overview of who we are, we at the Energy Saving Trust were established in the UK in 1992 after the Rio Earth Summit, and our focus is really looking to help people save energy and reduce CO2 emissions. We have 200 staff based across our offices in England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. And as I said, our objective is to reduce harmful emissions by promoting sustainable, efficient use of energy and transport. We do this by delivering free and impartial advice to both to consumers, businesses and local authorities across the UK. And our advice covers a wide range of topics, including energy efficiency, water saving, renewables and transport. So that's who we are. First of all, we're going to ask a very quick poll of everybody that's signed in today. So you should see that question pop up on screen shortly. So the first question is, well, the question today is, do you think there will be an EV model that meets your needs in the next 2 years? And the options you've got are yes, no, and don't know. So I'd be grateful if you could pop your response in there, and we'll see what the initial reaction is. We'll just give it a minute or two for everybody to put their responses in. Okay, so there's the results in there, and we are looking 1 second at quite a high number of people saying yes, relatively small number saying no, and again, relatively small number saying don't know. So it's good to see that most people are very positive, but we've got a small number, I think 12% or so, to try and change the minds or try and win them over in the course of today's webinar. So that's fantastic. So without further ado, we'll crack on with the next slides. So first of all, what is a ULEV? So an ultra-low emission vehicle can be defined as a vehicle that emits less than 75 grams of CO2 per kilometre at the tailpipe, and is also zero emission capable for at least 20 miles or 10 miles if the vehicle's capable has emissions of less than 50 grams per kilometre. And ULEVs fall into 3 key brackets at the moment. First of all, we have battery electric or pure EV vehicles, and these are vehicles that are powered purely by electricity. They have zero tailpipe emissions and very low running costs in terms of fuel and service maintenance and repair. The next group of ULEVs we have are extended range electric vehicles, or EREVs, and these vehicles combine a battery, electric drive motor, but they also have a petrol or diesel generator on board to support the vehicle and provide additional range as well. And then lastly, we have another popular bracket of ULEVs, which is called a plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, or PHEV. And these vehicles combine a battery, an electric drive motor, and an internal combustion engine, whether it be petrol or diesel. And there are a large number of those vehicles on the market now as well. So those are the three key brackets of electric vehicle. In terms of why electricity is a valuable, or why electricity is the way to go in terms of transport. There's a number of reasons for this. Electricity is significantly cleaner than petrol or diesel in terms of emission levels. And you can see here we've got a picture taken from the carbon intensity website, taken today actually, demonstrating how clean the energy mix is in Scotland. So the power mix in Scotland, as you can see here today, renewable energy in the form of wind and hydro are making up a significant portion of the energy in Scotland. So Scotland's energy mix is really clean, which means that any vehicles that were running on that energy are running in very clean power and therefore very low CO2 emissions. We're very lucky in the UK, and particularly in Scotland, to have a wide variety of renewable options available to us, whether it be tide, wind, wave power, hydropower, as we said before. So we have a really good mix there. Electricity is readily available, and it's also highly efficient. If you factor in the energy required to process petrol and diesel, or even slightly alternative fuels such as hydrogen, there's energy input required to process them, whereas electricity is relatively efficient in terms of the generation to use. There's relatively low levels of energy used in the transfer of that power. So electricity is a good option in terms of transport. So what are the issues with petrol and diesel? I'm sure most of you listening today probably are fully aware of these, but we'll quickly rattle through them. So obviously, first of all, we have climate change and global warming, and the mountain of evidence supporting the fact that CO2 emissions are having an impact on global weather and weather patterns. And we're seeing increasingly more dramatic weather patterns on a year-on-year basis now. For example, here we've got climate change to make UK summers more than 5 degrees hotter by 2070, and we've seen in the news kind of regular news articles relating to worsening weather conditions on an annual basis now. So the evidence is really mounting that we're having an impact through our emissions. The second side of this is air quality. This is a really growing side, a growing issue, and is classed by many as a public health crisis for many people. The evidence again here is growing significantly in terms of the negative health impacts of air pollution in our towns and cities, and there, quite rightly, this is having an effect on stimulating both national government and local government to take action to try and reduce this as well, to try and reduce levels of particulate matter, particularly from diesel motors, but also just general emissions, toxic emissions that have a negative effect on human health. So this is the other side of the issue, which is also a really strong driver in terms of government policy at the moment. In terms of the Scottish Government policy, these are some points taken from the recent programme for government. So first up, we have the Scottish Government are planning to create 20 electric towns and cities across Scotland by 2025. So these are cities that are well placed to have a strong amount of electric vehicles running and supporting those cities. They're planning to electrify taxi ranks in major transport and tourist hubs. Taxis have been a key area of focus. Buses are also a relatively strong area of focus at the moment as well, as some of the big wins in terms of saving CO2 emissions and reducing emissions in the cities. They're investing a wide range of charge point infrastructure across Scotland. We're going to touch on the Charge Place Scotland network in a moment, but we've got a really wide-ranging and effective charge point network in Scotland at the moment. And the Scottish Government's also supporting consumers and businesses to switch to electric vehicles, and that's a lot of the activity that the Energy Saving Trust is involved in. That's what a lot of our activity is focused on at the moment. And we're also looking to widen access to electric vehicles through the likes of housing associations and car clubs as well. And there's a number of programs that are going live at the moment and going live in the coming year that will try and open up access to electric vehicles to a wide range of people across Scotland as well. So that's the Scottish Government's policy and kind of direction of focus at the moment. In terms of the Charge Point Scotland network, this is obviously the public charge point network across Scotland. So it's effectively made up of almost 1,000 charge points across Scotland at the moment. So really wide ranging from the islands right down to the borders. It's very simple to use in that with a £20 membership fee, you get an access card that unlocks virtually all of those public charge points at the moment, and the majority of them are still free to use. So it's a real incentive for people to use the charging network at the moment, and it's continuing to expand this year as well. And is made up of a variety of chargers, from rapid chargers that can deliver a significant amount of charge in maybe 30-40 minutes, down to fast chargers and kind of destination points, and slow chargers as well. So there's a real mix of chargers available to people across the network. In terms of the funding support available from ourselves here at the Energy Saving Trust, there's a lot of support there to help both businesses and consumers make the switch to low carbon transport. So first of all, we have the ChargePlace Scotland Grant Fund, which is basically grant funding for a home charge point and also grant funding towards workplace charge points. And this fund is basically designed to remove some of the cost barriers to installing charge points for homes and workplaces. We also have the Low Carbon Transport Loan Funds. So for domestic customers, they have access to a loan of up to £35,000 that's interest-free and again repayable over 6 years. So a really affordable way of actually getting a hold of an electric vehicle at the moment. And then on the e-bike front, so we've also got a lot of programs focusing on e-bikes and e-cargo bikes as the kind of next phase rollout of ULEVs in the country. We have a loan scheme of up to £6,000 available to people, interest-free loan of £6,000, and that's repayable over 4 years. So again, a really affordable way of getting a hold of this kind of current technology. And these schemes are open. We also have schemes open to businesses as well. So similar schemes to these were the domestic schemes. We also have a similar offering to businesses. So it's all part of our overall a kind of widespread offering of support and advice to businesses and consumers. So there's a lot of help out there at the moment. This slide gives you a bit of an overview, just to give you a flavour of how things have changed in the EV market over recent years. And I'm sure Ben is going to go into a lot more detail than this, but this gives you a really quick snapshot of what's happened on the EV market. So you can see here from 2011 up to 2018, there's been a dramatic increase in number of models, plug-in vehicle models available on the market. We've gone from 6 models in 2011 up to over 180 models in 2018. And you can see that in the next 3 years, we're expecting an additional 80 new models as well. And if you follow any of the kind of online media streams, if you're looking at the Geneva Motor Show that was happening last week, you can see that EVs have been a real focus for all manufacturers. So whatever shape and size of vehicle you're potentially looking at for yourselves, it's very likely there'll be electric options in the very, very near future. In terms of Scotland as a whole, this slide here gives you a bit of an indication of how the predicted increase in EVs, or how the growth of EVs is predicted to change in Scotland in the coming years. We've also seen some really positive stats relating to Scotland in particular. For example, Scotland's rate of EV adoption has grown at twice the rate of the UK over the last year, and that probably reflects the policy support that's available in Scotland. We're fortunate to have that kind of support infrastructure in place. Just as a kind of snapshot there, you can see that EV uptake has increased by 30% in the northeast of Scotland, for example, and there'll be pockets of places where there's been really effective uptake. Dundee is obviously a case study that's obviously been talked about significantly, but there has been a real uptake in Scotland, which is fantastic. And we've also seen there's a growing second-hand market for EVs in Scotland as well. As the initial tranche of EVs that may have gone onto fleet vehicles, they'll be starting to come in through the second-hand market now. So we're seeing demand increase on the second-hand market for EVs, which is great as well. This is a really interesting slide, just to give you an indication of the changing cost of electric vehicles. First of all, the battery pack is basically the most expensive element in the electric vehicle, and that's what causes, initially it was causing the kind of major price difference between electric vehicles and petrol and diesel options. But this slide gives you an indication of the dramatic decrease in the cost of batteries over the last 7 or 8 years. And this is based on the amount of investment that's been poured into battery development globally, and the kind of improvements that have been seen, dramatic step changes in technological development over the last few years. So you can see here that the cost of batteries have dropped 80% between 2010 and 2017. And if you continue that trend, this will bring electric vehicles in line with petrol and diesel vehicles in terms of purchase price in the coming years. And the number, I think 2022 has been banded around as a potential year when we have price parity between those vehicles. And at that point, it becomes a no-brainer decision in terms of going for the electric, in that it can have significantly lower running costs, but it can deliver the mileage range that people are looking for on a day-to-day basis. So that brings us, that was a kind of brief introduction from ourselves here over the Energy Saving Trust. I'll next hand over to Dr. Ben Lane from Next Green Car. And Ben is the managing editor responsible for site content at Next Green Car. And his career has spanned academic research and independent consultancy in both the technology and the environmental sectors. And he's worked in both the public and private sectors. So Ben's got a wealth of knowledge in this field. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Ben to carry on the remainder of the webinar.
Brilliant. Thanks, Gordon. That's great. Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, so great to be here today on the webinar for EST. And so I'm going to take forward some of the themes that Gordon's introduced there. And essentially, I want to take a global outlook, and I'll look at the various automotive regions as well. But I'd like to take sort of global summary or a snapshot of what's going on with the global EV market, and then as I said, we'll look at some of I'll present some figures for the regions as well, for the automotive regions, and then possibly if we want to focus more on the UK in the Q&A, I can pick up. I've got some more stats and more figures and more thoughts about what's actually happening in the UK. So we'll start globally and we'll come down to the UK level during the rest of the webinar. So just want to pick up what Gordon talked about what's pushing EVs. Well, certainly air quality and climate change. I won't say any more about those now because I think Gordon's covered those. But I think there are some other issues which are pushing or if you like, adding to the demise of the ICE while pushing the EV market forward. And one of those is obviously companies like Tesla, who are new market entrants, which even if EVs weren't as green as they are, there are lots of other reasons why automotive or the new entrants think that automotive can be done in a different way. Vehicles can be produced in different ways. Electric vehicles have fewer moving parts. They're simpler to make. Essentially, they're computers on wheels. So there are lots of other techie reasons why EVs are taking off as they are. And another reason to add to that is vehicle connectivity. Obviously, in the press, there's a lot of noise about driverless cars, automotive cars, and I'm sure you know about the tests that are going on around the world. But even without full automation, there's a wealth of connectivity between vehicles and in the street, and vehicles and pedestrians that are adding to safety and drivability. And if you have an electric powertrain, it's easier to bring those connectivity elements onto the platform. You can do it with ICE, but it's that much more difficult. So if you like, there's another two reasons why EV market is taking off. And then if we're looking at numbers, we're already over 5 million vehicles globally, and projections are for 35 or at least 35% global market share within 20-25 years, which is quite astounding given where we were a couple of years ago. So if we dive into the figures a little bit more, as I said, more than 5 million vehicles now. I think the second thing to note is that most of the sales are in 3 automotive regions: China, EU, and US. And China's, it might not be a surprise, but China is leading the way on current sales and also cumulative on the fleet. So on the left-hand side, you can see the sort of the uptick. Where if those of you who know about innovation theory and the S-curve, it's classic S-curve. We're at the beginning of the S as with the exponential rise, and if you like, the market is taking off and accelerating. We haven't finished that acceleration yet. So each year, more vehicles are being added to the fleet, to the global park. So last year we had about 2 million vehicles added to bring the cumulative fleet over 5 million. This year we'll probably see about 3 million added. So you can see the whole market's accelerating away. And then globally, PIV, plug-in vehicle sales, are around 2% of all vehicle sales. China hit a peak of about 4.8%, and about a year ago we actually had a month where we hit 4.2% in the UK. So it shows you that those sort of production rates are possible. But against that, bottom right, you can see that given that there's an existing fleet and these new vehicles are adding to that fleet, and so far we're only about 0.4%. But in the rest of the presentation, I'm going to focus mostly about sales, because obviously the sales of today are the fleet of the next 10 to 15 years. And then, yeah, just to again, to take that sort of breakdown on where the sales are happening, and the chart on the left shows you that the activity in China has been extraordinary. I mean, it's been extraordinary globally, but China even more so. And again, that's been driven by very clear government policy and the need to improve air quality in the Chinese megacities. So you can see in the last 5 years, China has come from almost nowhere to being the number one sales region. So on the right, even though the figures there are from the first half of 2018, you can see that China's responsible for around over a third of all vehicle sales. So it should be no surprise that a lot of the innovation is going on in China, and we don't see many domestic Chinese vehicles on European roads yet. The Chinese manufacturers are focusing on domestic market, but I think in the next decade or two, Chinese brands will become commonplace in Europe and the US. So there's a big shift going on amongst the manufacturers and with the disruptors and the new entrants, and we'll talk a bit about that in a couple of slides. And then just sort of breaking the numbers down by country and also focusing on the proportion of the different types of vehicles. So Gordon mentioned the 3 types of vehicles: there's pure EV, there's range extender, and there's plug-in hybrid. So in the UK, if you look at the EV sales in the UK, we've got about 2/3 plug-in hybrid. So that's with a small internal combustion engine. But globally, it's actually the other way around. And again, China sort of skewing the figures for the global percentages. So overall, we actually see that pure EVs represent around 2/3 of all new electric models. And the reason that that's important is because those consumers and business users new to EVs will often think that they need an engine, a small engine, to extend their range. But actually, battery prices are coming down so fast and the ranges are going up so quickly that globally, that's not what the average consumer. That's not the perspective of the average consumer. 2/3 of consumers are more than happy with the range of a pure EV with no engine backup or engine extender. So if we look at how the market has developed over the last 7 or 8 years, I mean the vehicles on this slide are actually, they're taken from the US, but it's whether you're looking at the UK or Europe or elsewhere, the issues would be the same. And there are 2 key issues and factors which have changed over the last 7 or 8 years. And first is the increase in real driving range, and that's really because the battery prices are coming down. So as battery prices fall, they've fallen by over 75% in the last 5 years. Obviously, you can pack, for the same price, you can pack more cells into a vehicle, so therefore extending the range. So we've moved from sort of 50 to 100 miles real driving range, and most of the new models now are capable of over 200 miles, and that's real range, not official test. So and obviously that ticks all the boxes for the average consumer, and also helps businesses who with their duty cycles. And at the same time, the number of models is also covers more segments. So at the beginning, when Tesla first appeared, they were the key premium market. There were a small number of other EVs in sort of city car runabouts, but really almost all segments are now covered, with a few exceptions of small vans and possibly some of the hatchbacks. But I think it's likely that those gaps on the chart will be filled in the next 3, 4, 5 years. And the other way, if you like, to cut the cake is to think about how many miles you get for your money when you buy a car. So again, these are US illustrative figures, but they're exactly the same issue is at play in the UK. So we've moved for the same price. Essentially, you're getting a larger range. So we've moved from hundreds of thousands of dollars for premium models to 40 to 50,000 dollars for a high quality product. It may not be premium, but it's certainly high quality. And if you look at the used cars that EVs that are available now, there's a lot of models which are sort of not brilliant, not terrible quality, but not great. But the build quality is really improved, and that's because of all the investment that's gone in from the major OEMs. And then if we, for a moment, actually focus on the UK as far as the value, at Next Gen Car, we monitor the market and we compare the range of the latest models with the on-the-road price, the OTR price. And if you divide one by the other, you can see the Kia Niro and the Hyundai Kona, essentially they're broadly the same, but they're approaching £100 per real world driving range. So the Teslas of this world are off the bottom of this chart. They're sort of over 250, 300. So you can see that as new models are coming to the market, OEMs are increasingly focusing on the mass market rather than the premium. And as the battery prices fall, they're able to develop incredible value. And it's essentially for this reason that we awarded Kia and Hyundai awards at the back end of last year. So just want to take a quick tour of the brands that you will find in different parts of the world. Initially, this slide showing you the global market, and it's probably no surprise that Tesla are pretty much at the top. I'd say they are at the top because BYD, which is a Chinese company, Build Your Dreams, they produce battery electric, but they also do plug-in hybrids. But essentially, Tesla is the world-leading pure EV manufacturer. And if you were tracking last year the production rate of the Model 3s, last summer there was a battle to produce, I think it was 3,000 in a week. They hit that target. That essentially pushed them into profitability. And essentially they're now at producing at least 1,000 Model 3s a day, and it's probably around in the next year, Tesla with the Model 3 will probably be responsible for around 10% at least of all new EVs on the roads across the world, which is an incredible feat. And now they're in profitability. I think Tesla's definitely going to be around for a very long time indeed. They've moved from the disruptor to one of the major players. And it's also worth noting the position of some of the incumbents, some of the existing companies. And I'll just draw your attention to the position of Ford, which is third from the bottom there. And you can see that even they're focusing still on plug-in hybrids. So I think it's quite sort of obvious to see that companies like Ford, who aren't innovating, are very highly exposed, given where the market is going. So it doesn't look like companies like Ford are ready for the next decade. I think there's a chance they could catch up, but I think that there's quite a lot of work they need to do. And just to dive into the three areas. So we've got the European EV market. So the plug-in models that you're probably familiar with in the UK, the Nissan Leaf, the Renault Zoe, and the BMW i3. There's also the Outlander, which is a plug-in hybrid, but just focusing on the pure electrics. These are the electric vehicles that you've probably seen on UK roads. These are figures from the first half of last year, but it's still broadly the same position. Those makes and brands and models are the dominant pure electric models of the day and are likely to be for some time. I think one interesting thing to note on the i3 that's in the third position there is that until last year they did offer a pure EV and an extended range electric vehicle. In fact, they were probably the only manufacturer to offer that extended range vehicle. But now the ranges have got above 200 miles. They've actually dropped that from their model list. So in a sense, we are down to two EV types. There's the plug-in hybrid with a small to middle-sized engine and the pure EV. And I think the way the market's going is that the range extender, sometimes called the REX, is likely just to fall away. Even 3 years ago, there's a lot of debate about whether that technology was actually in the consumer's interest or was actually going to provide the solution for the powertrains for most drivers. But I think the feeling now is that pure EVs are going to do it, and that a battery on its own will provide enough range for most drivers. If we have a look at the US, because obviously Tesla is a Californian company, I mean, in a way it's no surprise that Tesla are at the top, but I think what may be a surprise is they take the top 3 slots. And essentially, from a US perspective, Tesla are just dominating the market. It's partly because they have different requirements of vehicles and different expectations about sort of size of vehicle and sort of driving experience, and they're also less dependent on imports. I guess with Trump around, that's probably even more so now. But I think the fact that Tesla is the world leader and is a domestic US producer really goes most of the way to show that to explain Tesla's dominance. But I think what's surprising is that the US incumbents like Ford and GM are sort of nowhere to be seen. And I think again, if we were able to give advice to the boards in those companies, it would be, you really need to get your skates on and focus on electric very, very quickly indeed, because the market's moving so fast. And just a brief look to the Chinese market. I guess most of you listening will be less knowledge about the Chinese market, but I think the key takeaway here is that most of the Chinese vehicles that are being sold are actually coming from Chinese domestic brands. The BJEV is Beijing Automotive, BYD that I mentioned only before, Build Your Dreams, SAIC is Shanghai Automotive, and partly because of restrictions on foreign manufacturers producing and selling in China, but also because of the levels of investment that the Chinese domestic automotives are making. Currently they're dominating in Chinese market, and I think what's more likely to happen is that those brands will become well known in the US and Europe at the same time, where some of the more European, the brands we may know better will make it to the Chinese market. In position 10, you can see there's a manufacturer called Geely, which they're a holding company. They're really interesting because a couple of years ago they bought London Taxi International, which is now the London Eevee taxi company, and they also own Volvo. So Geely is a very interesting player because it has a sort of international, already has an international sort of operations as well as having a stronghold in China. So they're definitely one to watch. I just wanted to go through just an overview of the established and emerging EV brands in the UK and Europe. And what I've done is I've sort of placed the sort of well-known brands and the newer brands on a sort of left-right axis. So you can see incumbents on the left, disruptors on the right. I'd say word of warning, it's very unscientific. It's basically my personal positioning of them, and you could place a lot of these manufacturers in different positions. But I think, if we just a very quick overview, they're incumbents in the sense of they've been in the EV industry for quite a while, or they're an established player with a strong interest in EV. So you've got companies like BYD and Renault towards the left. Of course, Nissan were a world leader with the Leaf, and they're still I think the leading EV car globally. And then in the middle of the chart, you've got companies like Hyundai and Kia, South Korean companies, and BMW, who came to the EV market a little bit more recently, but are doing so in a very clear and strategic way to produce, certainly with Hyundai and Kia, to focus on the mass market, producing incredibly good value, pounds for mile, as we saw earlier. And I think South Korea, alongside Japan, is likely to prove very, very strong in the EV space in the next couple of decades. And then moving to the right, we've got JLR based here, and the I-Pace has won a lot of awards. So JLR only have one pure EV at the moment, but I think the response they're getting and the sales that will come during this year, I think we'll see a lot more pure EVs coming from JLR. And then the disruptors, already mentioned Tesla, of course. There are some other new players which you'll hear more about in the coming years, and one such is NIO, a Chinese company that are looking to go globally. And what's interesting about NIO is that they're revisiting battery exchange, which is a battery swap technology where the car drives into a port, robots come onto the car, they take an existing battery out, the depleted battery, and put a fully charged one in. Currently they're the only manufacturer looking at that. There are lots of reasons that it may not work, but perhaps in the Q&A we can talk about the pros and cons of battery swap, if that's what we want to do. So a couple of slides to finish, just to look at market forecasts, and I just wanted to start the forecast section with just a reminder of the key market drivers. So Gordon had the slide with the reducing year-on-year reduction in battery prices. So yeah, almost 80% reduction in the last 5 years. Like the photovoltaic market, prices are continuing to fall. And so if you look at how that, so this slide shows how that translates to the vehicle price as a whole. So you can see as the battery, as the green section of the bar falls away, that within 5, 6, 7 years at the latest, EVs are going to become cheaper to produce and to own than ICEs. Now, every time that a new study comes out, it seems to pull those years forward, but certainly Bloomberg a couple of years ago were looking at only about 5 or 6 years away, and I think they've actually pulled those forecasts forward. So, no matter what the pros and cons of EVs from an environmental reason, cost production itself is driving the market, and it will increasingly do that. And then alongside that, you've got other vehicle trends, such as the problems that diesel have had in the last couple of years. Across the world, diesel sales are falling, and in the UK alone, between 2017 and 2018, diesel sales for new cars fell by about 30%. So we're seeing the rise of the EVs on one side, alongside reductions in sales for internal combustion engines. So staying with Bloomberg, who have done a lot of work in this field, their most recent forecasts, and I'll just focus on the left for now, is to look at the annual global light duty sales, and essentially they're predicting, say around in about 10 years' time, that over a quarter of all new car sales globally will be electric, whether that's pure or plug-in hybrid. And given where we are now, under 3%, that's an extraordinary change for a global industry like automotive. And I think the other thing to add to what that left-hand chart says is that's the average. And the other key issue is to consider that there are EV leading markets. So in Europe, that's the UK, Germany, and France. And fortunately, the UK is amongst one of the global EV leading markets for new car sales. So in those leading markets, such as the UK and the US and China, the figures and the increase and the switch from ICE to EV is going to be even faster than the left-hand chart suggests. And then the other consideration is to think about what happens to conventional vehicles and conventional fuels. So another piece of work that Bloomberg did a couple of years ago now, but the standings still stand. In fact, they've updated them recently as well. But so essentially, Bloomberg, what they looked at was that as EV sales were on the rise, they thought, well, how soon would diesel and petrol sales have to fall before there was a problem in the conventional fuel market. Now, looking at the recent oil glut of 2014-16, when there was overproduction of about 2 million barrels a day, they've crunched the numbers, and they think that if you chart the reduction in oil demand, that as EVs rise, the demand in oil reduces, and those charts, the three scenarios that those three green lines represent, are essentially when the reduction crosses the 2 million barrels of oil a day threshold. And by their reckoning, again, we're looking for only 5, 6, 7 years away. And in the short term, that might mean that oil, petrol and diesel becomes quite cheap. But in the longer term, that means that investment will very rapidly switch from looking for oil, taking oil out the ground, to investing in battery and renewable electricity, new energy supplies. And then just to finish off with another forecast, this time from Future Smart Strategies. Now, this analysis takes into account another issue, which is that, and I'm not sure I'm completely signed up to this, but there are a number of analysts who believe that with the rise of mobility services, the total number of vehicles required globally will also reduce. So if you look at the top of the solid chart, not only does it increase up to sort of 2023, but then the total solid block starts to fall away as connected cars come in, meaning there are more e-mobility ride services, and obviously the driverless car is in the mix. Now, if you add that in to the switch from ICE to electric, which is the switch from orange to green on the chart, then the reduction in oil use happens even faster than it would otherwise do so. So it may be that it may be that as well as the rise of the EVs bringing the demise not just of the ICE but also of the oil market, it may be that the new e-mobility services add to the problems of ICE and therefore accelerate the switch to electric vehicles. So I'm going to finish at that point. I'm going to hand back to Gordon or to Heather, and I'm open to questions in the remainder of the webinar.
Thanks a lot, Ben. I'm sure everybody found that as interesting as I did. That was really good insight into what's potentially going to happen with the sector over the coming years. So I'll quickly just carry on with a final slide from us regarding Home Energy Scotland. So if you are looking for additional advice, either as a domestic customer or as a business, please call through to the network of advice centres across Scotland, the Home Energy Scotland advice centres, using the free phone number at the top of this slide. Where you can get access to a wealth of free and impartial advice, looking at transport as well as all the other forms of energy saving, whether it be renewable input into your home or just general behaviour change that you could adopt to save money. And there's also a way that's where you can get a referral point for the loan schemes that are currently available for both the electric vehicle loan and the e-bike loan scheme. So we'd highly recommend people get in contact to ask about that. So I think that brings us over to the Q&A session for today's webinar. So I'll just pass over to my colleague Heather Quinn, who's going to take over and ask some of the questions that have been generated throughout Ben's presentation. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Heather.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Ben and Gordon, both really interesting presentations, and it has sparked a number of questions, which is great. So first question for Ben. So with the likes of Hyundai Kona and Kia e-Niro more or less being sold out until 2020, how do you foresee the supply chain affecting EV adoption, and what are the biggest threats to the supply chain?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, in one sense, it's a good thing. I mean, imagine that we had oversupply. If we had oversupply, the OEMs would be thinking twice about whether they made the right decision. So the fact that the market and the demand is ahead of supply, overall is a good thing, because it means that the investment is going to continue going into the electric sector, but from the user's point of view, it's not a good thing. So I'm not saying that it's not without its problems. And I think the the fact that the orders are taking so long to come through is an issue. As far as the reasons that's happening, I think there are a number of issues. I think the battery production itself is one bottleneck, and that's one reason that Tesla has started building its third gigafactory in China. I think the second one is not producing yet, but I think it's closer to doing so. So battery production is definitely one problem, and I also think the production line, the availability is also slowing the process down. So, even going back 2 years, a lot of the major players were still making decisions at the board level, were still testing prototypes, were still a little bit unsure about whether to plow the tens of billions into development of new models. I think the brakes are off, and I do think it's going to take 2, 3, 4 years for supply to catch up with demand, and it's probably going to lag to somewhat for quite some time. But I think we need to reduce the number of months, but reduce the lag as far as we can, and I just hope that happens sooner rather than later.
Fab. And sort of going on from that as well, do you think the battery production, that being an issue, do you think that's one of the reasons that conventional manufacturers are holding back?
Personally, I think because a lot of the conventional manufacturers are still wedded to their ICE powertrains. From their perspective, they've made significant investments, and they may not have got all the revenues back that they were hoping for. So, the likes of Tesla and NIO have a much easier deal. They're coming in. They've got a smaller number of products. They're completely focused on pure electrics, and they know their target market very well. If you're an incumbent OEM that's been around for 100 years, you've got existing customers, you've got existing internal processes. You're still monetizing your internal combustion engines, and you've got factories and production lines that are geared up for the wrong technology. So so you need to work on two fronts. Those players need to develop new products for EVs while working out how to wind down or modify or retool those existing product lines. So I think battery production bottleneck is one reason, but I think until even now there are a couple of large manufacturers that haven't yet made the psychological switch that electric is going to be the only game in town within a decade or less.
Yeah. And what are the feelings amongst the industry about terms such as self-charging for mild hybrids, and how do you feel that this is confusing the customer? Do you think this is an issue?
I think it could be an issue. I think, put it this way: if you're a consumer and you're confused and you buy one and it's not what you thought, that's not a great customer experience. I mean, consumers there's plenty of information out there. Next Green Car and ESD site, lots of other sites. So I think most EV buyers are pretty well informed because they go and find information. And to be honest, I think terms like self-charging are going to be self-defeating. I think people will see through them pretty quickly, but they certainly don't help. And I think it would be much better to focus on what are the pros and cons between the pure electric and plug-in hybrid. Because if you run a taxi fleet or delivery fleet, it may be that your range is just well beyond 250 miles a day and you need a plug-in hybrid. And I think in the EV sector we should be open about that and say this is the vehicle for you. A small engine is absolutely fine, and it will enable you to drive electric for as much of the range as possible, certainly within urban areas. But you've got a vehicle that can deliver what your business needs. So I think we need to do more education, but certainly need to be more precise and honest about the terminology that we use.
Yeah, and Are there any upcoming models or brands that you're particularly excited about?
I think Neo, because there's one reason I put them on the chart. I think what Neo are trying to do is that they're a Chinese brand, but they're looking to become a global brand from the start. Because a lot of the Chinese brands, like BYD, were essentially happy initially delivering to the Chinese market, but I think the global EV market needs new players like Tesla, and I think Neo will join them in that space, not only on the premium market but for mass production as well. But I think in a way they're being quite audacious in revisiting the battery exchange, the battery swap model. I mean, I don't know if people remember a project called or company called Better Place, which was around until about 4 or 5 years ago. They were an Israeli company that really went for battery swap technology big time. They got Renault to sign up, and they built lots of prototypes and showed that it was possible. Unfortunately, they only got Renault to sign up, and that was the key problem. Is that if you want to make battery swap a mass solution, or a mass market solution, then you need virtually all the manufacturers to sign up to the same standard. So I think Neo will make some progress, but I think they'll probably, personally, I think they'll hit the standards issue. But I think the fact that I don't think they're wedded only to battery swap, because I think they've got some great product, and they're already on their second car. So I would look out for Neo. I mean, it's definitely worth checking out their company website. I think if you do that, you'll get an impression of how large is their ambition.
Fab. And then another question, it's sort of two questions in one almost. If Ford or GM were to start producing EVs, do you see them having a chance of catching up with Tesla? And are you aware of any plans from Ford to start producing EVs now?
Yeah. Actually, before I come to that question, for the last question, I also forgot to mention Dyson as well. So Dyson, as we know, a lot in the news have relocated to Singapore. Dyson have already gone public that they have 3 EVs in the pipeline. So I think alongside Tesla, as well as Neo joining them, I think Dyson will become a major player more rapidly than people might think. So yeah, switching to the incumbents, and your question, Heather, I think they could catch up, but I think they will need to be laser focused with their strategy to do so. So I think at the moment there are more reasons that they won't make it, because they won't make the strategic decision internally, and because they may fail to essentially give up on their current business model and adopt a new business model. I think the other, without naming names, some of the big companies have a lot of debt. The focus last year was, would Tesla make it, because Tesla had a lot of debt. But it's one thing having debt when you're a startup and then hitting profitability and keeping your shareholders happy. It's another when you're an incumbent, when you're battling against new players and you've got billions of debt on the balance sheet. Plus, you may have issues with tariffs, again, without mentioning any names. So I think the odds may be against them, but I think they could make it if they started now and they managed to deal with investment and debt issues.
Perfect. And we've got a question for Gordon, but maybe Ben can follow up afterwards as well. Gordon, what are the issues to be aware of if you want to buy a second-hand EV?
Well, some of the key things to think about if you are buying a second-hand EV is, first of all, whether there's a battery rental agreement in place. So you may want to check if the vehicle you're buying is already tied into a rental agreement, and those rental agreements will have to continue with the new buyer as well. So it's worth checking that out. And it's also worth checking out whether there's a warranty in place for the battery as well. So you may still have years worth of warranty in place for the battery pack on those second-hand vehicles. But largely, I mean, what I would say about second-hand vehicles is that there's a growing a growing amount of evidence to suggest that the battery packs are lasting very well. So I would try and encourage people to have a bit of faith in the technology you're buying in. So, I mean, the manufacturers are providing warranties of 8 years and 100,000 miles on battery packs. But there's cases now, or we've had cases over the last few years of vehicles that have been intensively used in the likes of taxi, as taxis, for example, and the battery packs have held up very, very well for 150,000+ miles. So I would encourage people to really seriously consider a second-hand EV as a good investment, as the indications are that the battery chemistry is lasting particularly well at the moment. I'm sure Ben can potentially add in there as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with all of that. I think, yeah, warranty is, there definitely needs to be a warranty on the battery, or if you've only got a year or two left, probably not a good idea. But given that most used EVs are, probably 2, 3, 4 years old, then the warranty is likely to be there. I think the other thing I'd say about buying a used EV is that EVs are very, the way EVs are designed and the drivability of different models and also different variants, they change. There's a lot of variation there. So I think you need to test drive it and see if you can borrow it for a day, because not EVs are the same. A lot of them have different levels of control. For instance, on regen braking, so the Mitsubishi Outlander has a paddle on the steering column where you can change the level of regen as you drive. We've got a company Leaf that's got, you've got 2 levels of regen and oil, and it's part of the way you drive in EVs. You switch between those. So I think you should be really comfortable with the driver experience and the level of control with that particular model, but also be careful that models change over the years. For instance, I mentioned the i3. You can buy a used i3 with a range extender, but you can't buy a new one. So if you're looking for a range extender, actually a used model with the i3 is actually probably a better choice than the latest version.
Interesting. And well, quite a question coming up. What policy change in the UK would be needed to increase the share of pure electric vehicles in line with the 60% of total ULEVs elsewhere in the world? Quite a big question. Who wants to take it?
Yeah, go on, Gordon.
I'll let you go ahead, Ben. After you.
I mean, I think more could be done. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that UK government has actually done to date has done pretty well in putting so much money into the EV sector. If you added up all the money that's gone in between 2011 and 2020, or that's been allocated for EV charging and also grants, I think it's over 900 million. So that's almost £1 billion. So that, and not many other sectors, especially in these times, not many other sectors are sort of being treated so well. So I think the UK government as a whole, I'm speaking about UK more than Scotland, but the UK broadly got it right. I mean, the most recent changes, they got rid of the plug-in hybrid grants and slightly reduced the pure electric. I think probably the reducing the pure electric level of support was a small mistake. I think I'd like to see that increased, but I think the real wins, and I think this is happening in Scotland, it's also happening in some areas of England. Nottingham's leading the way, is that if businesses have have funds that they can call on to renew their fleets with really good payback times or interest-free loans, that sort of thing, I think that's the real key winner. And at the moment, that's not happening across the UK, and I think that could happen more. And one other thing I'd say, apart from money, is that what EV drivers really respond to is gaining access to areas that they wouldn't be able to normally gain access. And I'm thinking here of bus lanes. And I know it is quite contentious, but I think I would make the argument that for the next couple of years, if zero emission vehicles were allowed into some bus lanes to get preferential access, that would obviously have huge impact on some commuting times. And I think there's a lot of research to show that's worth thousands of pounds in sort of in additional access value to users, and I think we haven't really sort of use that type of measure enough. And I think if we leave it too long, we won't be able to do it because there'd be too many EVs. So now's the time.
Great. I would totally agree with Ben there, just to chip in at the end as well. In terms of the preferential access and things like even free parking, I know that some of the cities in Scotland have definitely trialled that. Dundee and Glasgow, and that was a very popular way of encouraging early adoption to go down the EV route. But also in terms of as Ben was talking about, the funding support, we're actually very lucky in Scotland that we've had a very supportive funding framework in place for a number of years. So the low carbon transport loans available in Scotland, interest-free loans to help both consumers and businesses buy plug-in vehicles, has been a real driver in helping people manage that initial cost of the vehicle and spread that over a number of years. So I would say we're quite fortunate in that's the approach that's been taken by the Scottish Government.
And if I could just add one quick thing, and until a couple of years, well, until about last year, it was possible to buy an EV and essentially have free charging for life, and essentially that was the Tesla. So if you had a Tesla Model S until about a year ago, you could drive to all the superchargers, and you know, not only would you have a space to park, but you would also have free electricity. But Tesla have actually pulled away from that. So maybe that tells us that globally that isn't a sustainable solution, just because of the amount of energy now used to charge EVs is on the increase. But I think free access to money in the sense of 0% interest, free access to road space, and free access to parking and charging, a combination of those as appropriate for a particular country or a particular region is definitely what's needed.
Perfect, thank you. So one final question, because we've sort of reached sort of the end of the webinar, but will wireless charging ever be an option?
I'll let Ben take that one. Yeah, you go for it.
I'll try. I think right now it's not an option right now. There are lots of Highways England have been running a project or developing a project to see what technology is possible. There are probably at least a dozen projects worldwide where roads, several miles of road are being sort of dug up and set up for wireless charging. I don't think the technology is there yet. I think that in principle it could work. If there are any physicists out there, it's magnetic resonance is the technology of choice. You actually reduce the losses, even though you have a gap between the vehicle and the road, you can actually reduce the losses to I think 5 or 10%. There are companies like Qualcomm who produce a vehicle a charging induction device you can use in your garage or at home. But I think for the mass market, it's a couple of years away. But I think in the longer term, that there will be a technological solution with that approach, and I can't see any reason why it couldn't be commercialized at some point. But it may be we're a decade away before that happens.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Ben, for joining us on the webinar. It was really interesting, and like I said, this will be available on our YouTube channel, and also still available through the GoToWebinar platform as well. For anyone that didn't manage to get their questions answered, we will answer them by email. But just to say as well that the Next Green Car website is a fantastic resource for anyone looking to compare vehicles with the calculators. It compares internal combustion engine vehicles with the EVs, breaks it down. It's really sort of really simplifies everything, but still goes into a tremendous amount of detail. So please do, we would definitely recommend using that resource. If anyone's got any other questions as well, then you can email us directly using the email address there. But like I said, sort of big thanks to Dr. Ben Lane from Next Green Car for joining us today, and big thanks to Gordon Manson as well from Energy Saving Trust. Thank you.